The summer sun beat down on the peaceful neighborhood of Pine Grove in Virginia Beach. It was one of those perfect July afternoons when the temperature hit just right. Not too hot, not too cool. The kind of day that made kids want to play outside until their parents called them home for dinner. At the community splash pad, 12-year-old Marcus Thompson stood guard over his little sister Tiana, who was 10. Their mother had taught them to always look out for each other. Marcus took this job very seriously, especially when their mom was away at the naval base for work. "Marcus, watch this," Tiana called out, her bright pink swimsuit flashing in the sunlight as she danced between the water jets. Her braids, carefully done by their mom the night before, were now dripping wet, but her smile was bigger than ever. Marcus couldn't help but grin at his sister's joy. Their friends Kevin and Lisa from 2 houses down were there too, along with a few other neighborhood kids. They had all grown up together on these streets, making the splash pad their summer headquarters. The sound of children laughing mixed with the splash of water and the distant chirping of birds. "Hey, let's play water tag," Kevin suggested, adjusting his blue swimming goggles. The other kids quickly agreed, and soon they were running around, trying to dodge both the water jets and each other. Their squeals of delight echoed across the small park. Mrs. Rodriguez watched the children from her corner store across the street. She had owned that shop for 20 years and knew all the local kids by name. She often kept an eye on them while selling cold drinks and ice cream to tired parents. Today, she smiled as she restocked the freezer, remembering when her own children, now in college, used to play at that same splash pad. "Marcus, can you help me reach the higher jet?" little Amy from down the block asked. At 7, she was the youngest in their group. Marcus walked over and lifted her up carefully, just like he'd seen his mom do with Tiana when she was smaller. Amy giggled as the water sprayed in different patterns, creating a rainbow in the mist. The afternoon was perfect until Officer James Barrett's patrol car slowly rolled down Pine Grove Avenue. He was new to the area, having transferred from another precinct just 2 weeks ago. The children didn't notice him at first, too busy with their games and laughter. Barrett parked his car and sat watching the splash pad. His face grew darker with each passing minute as he observed the mixed group of kids playing together. The laughter that brought smiles to others seemed to irritate him more and more. Inside her store, Mrs. Rodriguez noticed the police car. She had been in the neighborhood long enough to know all the regular officers who patrolled their streets. This one was different. Something about the way he watched the children made her uneasy. She pulled out her phone and kept it ready, just in case. Marcus was helping Tiana fix her loose hair tie when he first spotted the officer getting out of his car. Having a mom in the Navy meant they had great respect for people in uniform. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Thompson had taught her children to always be polite to law enforcement, but also to be aware of their surroundings. "Look, a police officer," Tiana said excitedly, always happy to see someone in uniform like her mom. She waved at Officer Barrett, but he didn't wave back. Instead, he walked toward the splash pad with slow, heavy steps. The other kids started to notice too. The happy screams grew quieter, and the game of water tag slowed down. Even though they hadn't done anything wrong, something about Officer Barrett's approach made them nervous. Marcus stood a little straighter, moving closer to his sister. Their mom had always told them to stay calm in tough situations, just like she did in her Navy SEAL training. He watched as Officer Barrett came closer, his hand resting on his water bottle. The afternoon sun still shone brightly, but the perfect summer day was about to change. None of the children knew it yet, but the next few minutes would start something much bigger than their water games. Mrs. Rodriguez gripped her phone tighter, and Officer Barrett's face grew darker with each step toward the splash pad. Officer Barrett stopped at the edge of the splash pad, his boots just inches away from the water. His face was stern as he looked at the playing children, focusing particularly on Marcus and Tiana. The other kids slowly backed away, sensing something wasn't right. "This area is too noisy," Officer Barrett said loudly, his voice harsh against the sound of running water. "You're disturbing the peace." He took his water bottle from his belt, gripping it tightly. Marcus stepped forward politely, just as his mother had taught him. "We're sorry if we're being too loud, sir. We can try to be quieter." He stood tall, trying to be brave like his mom, even though his heart was beating fast. But Officer Barrett wasn't interested in Marcus's polite response. Instead, he unscrewed his water bottle and walked closer to where Marcus and Tiana stood. The other children watched in shock as he deliberately poured the water over Marcus's head. "How do you like that water?" Barrett asked with a mean smile. "Not so fun when someone else controls it, is it?" Tiana, seeing her brother getting wet, started to cry. "Stop it. Why are you being mean?" she asked through her tears. This only seemed to make Officer Barrett angrier. Mrs. Rodriguez watched everything from her store window. Her hands shook as she recorded the incident on her phone. She had known these kids since they were babies, and seeing them treated this way made her blood boil. But she knew the best help she could give was to document everything. "This is a public space," Barrett continued, now turning his attention to Tiana, "and I decide who gets to enjoy it." He emptied the rest of his water bottle over Tiana's head, making her cry harder. The other children stood frozen, not knowing what to do. Kevin took a step forward to help his friends, but his sister Lisa pulled him back, afraid the officer might target them next. Marcus put his arm around his crying sister, trying to shield her. His mom had always told them to stay strong in tough situations, but this was different. This wasn't like the stories she told them about her Navy SEAL training. This was scary in a different way. "You kids think you can just do whatever you want," Officer Barrett said, his voice getting louder. "Well, I'm here to teach you some respect." Just then, Mrs. Rodriguez rushed out of her store. She had sent the video to both the police department and to Sarah Thompson, and now she couldn't stay quiet anymore. "Officer," she called out firmly, her phone still recording. "These children have done nothing wrong." Barrett turned to face her, his expression changing slightly when he saw the phone in her hand. "This is police business, ma'am. Please step back." But Mrs. Rodriguez stood her ground. "I've been watching these kids all afternoon. They were just playing, following all the rules. I've already sent videos to your department." This news made Officer Barrett pause. His face turned a shade paler, but he tried to maintain his authority. "They were disturbing the peace," he insisted, but his voice was less confident now. Marcus held his sister closer as she wiped her tears. The splash pad water had been fun, but the water from the officer's bottle felt cold and mean. It wasn't about getting wet. It was about being singled out, being treated differently. The other kids slowly gathered around Marcus and Tiana, showing their support without words. Even though they were scared, they knew what the officer did was wrong. "My mom's a Navy SEAL," Tiana said suddenly, her voice shaking but proud. "She teaches people to be brave and good." Officer Barrett's face twitched at this information. He hadn't expected these kids to have a mother in such a powerful position. He took a step back, trying to think of what to do next. Mrs. Rodriguez was still recording everything. "Lieutenant Commander Thompson will be very interested in seeing this," she said calmly. "I believe she's teaching at the Naval Special Warfare Training Center today." The mention of Sarah Thompson's full title and position made Officer Barrett's face turn white. He knew he had made a terrible mistake. The peaceful summer afternoon had turned into something much more serious, and soon he would have to face the consequences of his actions. The water continued to spray from the splash pad jets, but no one was playing anymore. The fun afternoon had turned into a lesson about standing up to wrongdoing, and somewhere across town, a Navy SEAL mother was about to see exactly what had happened to her children. Mrs. Rodriguez's hands were still shaking as she walked back into her corner store. She had seen many things from behind her counter over the last 20 years, but nothing like this. The video she recorded felt heavy on her phone, like it carried the weight of great responsibility. She looked out her store window again, watching Officer Barrett retreat to his patrol car. The children were huddled together near the splash pad, no longer playing or laughing. Marcus was still holding his sister Tiana, both of them dripping from the officer's cruel act. "Come inside, children," Mrs. Rodriguez called out, her voice gentle but firm. "I have some clean towels in the back." She always kept extra towels in her store for kids who visited the splash pad. The group of children walked into the store, their wet feet leaving small puddles on the clean floor. Mrs. Rodriguez didn't mind. She had known these kids since they were babies. Watched them grow up right in front of her eyes while their parents bought milk and bread from her store. "Here, me more," she said, handing fresh towels to Marcus and Tiana. Then she reached into her freezer and pulled out 5 popsicles. "No charge today," she added with a warm smile, trying to bring back some joy to their faces. While the children sat on the bench near the window, Mrs. Rodriguez went to work. First, She sent the video to the police department's internal affairs division. She had their email because last year she had helped them solve a case of vandalism with her store's security cameras. Then she found Sarah Thompson's number in her phone contacts. Every parent who left their children to play near her store had given her their numbers for emergencies. But Sarah Thompson was different. She was more than just a Navy SEAL. She was a regular customer who always thanked Mrs. Rodriguez for keeping an eye on her kids. Mrs. Rodriguez typed out a message to Sarah. Lieutenant Commander Thompson, there has been an incident involving Marcus and Tiana at the splash pad. They are safe and with me at the store, but you need to see this video. Officer Barrett from the local precinct was involved. She attached the video and pressed send. The message showed 2 blue check marks almost immediately. Sarah had received it. Your mama will be here soon, Mrs. Rodriguez told Marcus and Tiana, who were quietly eating their popsicles. She's very strong and brave, just like both of you were today. Kevin, who was sitting next to Marcus, spoke up. We should have done something to help, he said, looking down at his feet. Mrs. Rodriguez shook her head. You did the right thing by staying calm. Sometimes the best way to fight wrong things is to make sure there are witnesses. That's what I did with my phone. I became a witness. She walked to her counter and pulled out her old notebook where she wrote down important things. In clear handwriting, she wrote down everything she had seen, the time, the date, Officer Barrett's behavior, and what he had said to the children. 20 years of running a store had taught her to keep good records. Through the store window, she could see Officer Barrett's patrol car still parked across the street. He was sitting inside, probably realizing the trouble he was in. Mrs. Rodriguez noticed he was making phone calls, his face looking worried. Mrs. Rodriguez, Tiana said quietly, will we get in trouble for telling on the police officer? The store owner knelt down next to Tiana's chair. No, my cielo. In America, even police officers have to follow rules. When they break these rules, it's our duty to report them. That's what makes our country special. Everyone has to follow the same rules. Just then, her phone buzzed with a message from Sarah Thompson. On my way, 10 minutes. Keep my children safe. Mrs. Rodriguez smiled, knowing what was coming. She had seen Sarah Thompson in her Navy uniform many times, had watched her command respect with just her presence. Officer Barrett had no idea who he had messed with. Your mom will be here very soon, she told Marcus and Tiana. And I have a feeling Officer Barrett is about to learn a very important lesson about judging people by how they look. The afternoon sun was starting to move lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the store windows. The splash pad's water jets continued their cheerful dance, but they would have to wait for another day to bring joy to the children. Today, they had witnessed something different. They had learned about standing up to injustice, about the power of evidence, and about how one person's brave act of recording could make a big difference. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Thompson was in the middle of teaching a training session when her phone buzzed. She never checked her phone during training, but something made her look this time. Maybe it was mother's instinct, or maybe it was the years of SEAL training that had taught her to trust her gut feelings. When she saw Mrs. Rodriguez's message and watched the video, her face didn't change. Years of military training had taught her to control her emotions, especially in difficult situations. But inside, her heart was racing with a mixture of anger and determination. Class dismissed, she told her students at the Naval Special Warfare Training Center. Her voice was calm and steady, just like always. The young SEAL candidates knew better than to ask questions when she used that tone. Sarah changed into her formal Navy uniform quickly but carefully. Every button was perfectly aligned, every crease sharp and precise. Her uniform wasn't just clothes. It was a symbol of authority and responsibility. Today, she would need both. As she drove her black SUV through the streets of Virginia Beach, Sarah thought about her children. Marcus, who always tried to be the protective big brother, just like she had taught him. And Tiana, whose bright smile could light up even the hardest days after SEAL training. She had taught them to be strong, to be proud, and to stand up for what was right, but she had also taught them to be careful because she knew the world wasn't always fair. As she gripped the steering wheel tighter, she remembered her own father's words, "Fight smart, not angry." 10 minutes later, Sarah pulled up in front of Mrs. Rodriguez's store. Through the window, she could see her children sitting with their friends, wrapped in towels and eating popsicles. The splash pad across the street was empty now, its water jets spraying into empty air. She also noticed Officer Barrett's patrol car parked nearby. He was still sitting inside, making phone calls. Sarah allowed herself a small, knowing smile. She had dealt with people like him before, people who felt powerful until they met someone more powerful than them. The bell above the store door chimed as Sarah walked in. Everyone turned to look, and the room fell silent. In her crisp navy uniform, with her shoulders straight and her head held high, Sarah Thompson was an impressive sight. "Mama." Tiana ran to her mother, followed quickly by Marcus. Sarah hugged them both tightly, feeling their still damp clothes against her uniform. She didn't care if it got wet. Her children were more important than any uniform. "Are you both okay?" she asked softly, looking them over. They nodded, and she could see they were more upset than hurt. That was good. Physical wounds heal quickly, but other kinds of wounds take longer. Mrs. Rodriguez stepped forward, holding out her phone. "I recorded everything, Lieutenant Commander," she said. "And I've already sent it to Internal Affairs." Sarah nodded, giving Mrs. Rodriguez a grateful smile. "Thank you for protecting my children," she said. Then she turned to the other kids. "Thank you all for being good friends to Marcus and Tiana." She stood up, straightening her uniform. "Now," she said, her voice taking on the tone she used when training Navy SEALs, "it's time to handle this properly." Through the store window, they could see Officer Barrett noticing Sarah's arrival. He sat up straighter in his patrol car, his phone conversation forgotten as he watched the uniformed officer emerge from the store. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Sarah said, "would you mind watching the children for a few more minutes? I need to have a conversation with Officer Barrett and his superiors." "Of course," Mrs. Rodriguez replied, "take all the time you need." Sarah hugged her children one more time. "Remember what I always tell you," she said quietly. "Stay strong and stand tall," Marcus and Tiana said together. As Sarah walked out of the store, her boots making precise clicks on the sidewalk, everyone watched. She wasn't just walking, she was marching with purpose, like she did on the naval base. Officer Barrett was about to learn that some people's strength comes not from a badge or a uniform, but from something much deeper, the power of doing what's right. The police station was quiet when Lieutenant Commander Sarah Thompson walked through the front doors. Her boots made sharp clicking sounds on the polished floor, and every officer she passed stood a little straighter when they saw her uniform. Officer Barrett had arrived just minutes before her, rushing through the back entrance. He was now sitting at his desk, pretending to do paperwork, but his shaking hands gave away his nervousness. "Good afternoon," Sarah said to the front desk sergeant. Her voice was calm and professional. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Thompson. I need to speak with Officer Barrett and his supervising officer." The sergeant recognized her name immediately. The Internal Affairs video had already made its way through the department. "Yes, ma'am. Captain Rivera is expecting you. Please follow me." They walked down the hallway to the captain's office. Through the glass walls, Sarah could see Officer Barrett being called in too. He looked much smaller now than he had at the splash pad. Captain Rivera, a woman with 25 years of police experience, stood up when Sarah entered. "Lieutenant Commander Thompson," she said, gesturing to a chair. "I've reviewed the video. I want you to know we take this very seriously." Sarah sat down, her posture perfect as always. Officer Barrett entered next, trying to avoid eye contact with everyone. The captain pointed to another chair, and he sat down quickly. "Officer Barrett," Sarah said, turning to face him. Her voice wasn't angry or loud. Instead, it was calm and clear, the same voice she used when teaching young SEAL candidates important lessons. "Would you like to explain why you poured water on my children today?" Barrett shifted in his chair. The confident bully from the splash pad was gone, replaced by a nervous man facing the consequences of his actions. I was responding to a noise complaint," he mumbled. "There was no noise complaint called in today," Captain Rivera said, checking her computer. "In fact, there hasn't been a single complaint about that splash pad all summer." Sarah leaned forward slightly. "My children were playing in a public space, following all the rules. Mrs. Rodriguez's video shows this clearly. What I want to know is, why did you single them out?" The room fell silent. Everyone knew the real reason, but Barrett couldn't say it out loud. His face turned red with shame. "I trained hundreds of young men and women to serve their country," Sarah continued. I teach them that true strength comes from protecting others, not from bullying children. I teach them that the uniform, whether it's military or police, is a symbol of service, not power. Captain Rivera nodded in agreement. She pulled out Barrett's personnel file. This isn't the first complaint about your behavior, Officer Barrett, but it will be the last one at this precinct. Barrett finally looked up. Are you firing me? His voice was barely a whisper. No, Sarah said before the captain could answer. That's not what I want. Both Barrett and the captain looked at her in surprise. What I want, Sarah continued, is for you to learn from this. I want you to understand why your actions were wrong. I want you to become the kind of police officer who protects all children, regardless of how they look. Captain Rivera smiled slightly. Lieutenant Commander Thompson is being more generous than many would be in her position. Here's what's going to happen. You'll be suspended without pay for 2 weeks. During that time, you'll attend additional training on community relations and racial bias. When you return, you'll be assigned to community service work, including organizing activities at that same splash pad. Sarah stood up, her full height and presence commanding the room. My children will be there, Officer Barrett. They'll be playing with their friends, enjoying their summer, and they'll be watching to see what kind of officer, what kind of person you choose to become. She turned to leave, then stopped at the door. One more thing, she said, looking back at Barrett. The water you poured on my children today, it didn't make them weak. It made them stronger, because now they know that standing up to wrongdoing is more important than giving in to fear. As Sarah walked out of the police station, the setting sun made her shadow long on the sidewalk. She had fought many battles as a Navy SEAL, but this one felt different. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about changing hearts and minds, one person at a time. The next morning, Detective Maria Santos walked into the Internal Affairs office carrying a large cup of coffee. She had spent all night reviewing Officer Barrett's past cases, and what she found troubled her deeply. On her desk, a stack of files told a story that went beyond the splash pad incident. There were complaints from Barrett's old precinct that had never been properly investigated. Most of them had been dismissed or buried in paperwork. You need to see this, she called to her partner, Detective James Chen. She spread out 5 different case files on her desk. Look at the pattern. Chen looked through the files carefully. Each one showed similar behavior. Barrett targeting minority children and teenagers, always claiming they were disturbing the peace or acting suspiciously. But none of these cases had led to any serious consequences for Barrett. How did he keep getting away with this? Chen asked, shaking his head. Because nobody as powerful as Lieutenant Commander Thompson stood up to him before, Maria answered, taking another sip of her coffee. Just then, Sarah Thompson walked into the office. She wasn't wearing her Navy uniform today, but she still carried herself with the same quiet confidence. Thank you for coming in, Lieutenant Commander, Detective Santos said, pulling up a chair. We found some interesting information about Officer Barrett's past behavior. Sarah sat down and looked at the files spread across the desk. Her face remained calm, but her eyes showed concern as she read through the previous complaints. 5 similar incidents in his old precinct, Detective Chen explained. All involving minority children, all dismissed without proper investigation. Sarah nodded slowly. And now we know why he transferred to our precinct, she said. He was running from his past mistakes. Detective Santos pulled out Mrs. Rodriguez's video and played it again on her computer. This time, he messed up badly. We have clear video evidence, multiple witnesses, and a victim's parent who knows exactly how to handle this situation. What happens next? Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Her military training had taught her the importance of proper procedures. We're launching a full investigation, Detective Chen said. Not just into the splash pad incident, but into all these past cases too. We're interviewing everyone involved, the children, their parents, witnesses from the old cases. Detective Santos added, we're also looking into why these previous complaints were ignored. Someone at his old precinct helped cover these incidents up. We need to find out who and why. Sarah looked at the detectives with approval. This was how things should be done, thorough, professional, by the book. My children will tell you everything they remember, she said. And Mrs. Rodriguez has offered her store's security camera footage too. Perfect, Detective Santos said, making notes. We'll also need statements from the other children who were there. Their perspectives are important. Just then, Sarah's phone buzzed. It was a message from Marcus. "Mom, when can we go back to the splash pad? Our friends miss playing there." Sarah showed the message to the detectives. "This is what it's really about," she said softly. "Children should feel safe in their own neighborhood. They shouldn't have to fear the people who are supposed to protect them." Detective Chen nodded in agreement. "We're not just investigating one incident," he said. "We're trying to change a system that allowed these incidents to happen." "Change takes time," Sarah replied, thinking of her SEAL training exercises. "But it starts with people willing to stand up and do what's right." As the detectives continued their work, Sarah left the office feeling hopeful. The investigation would take time, but it would be thorough and fair. Officer Barrett's actions wouldn't be ignored or forgotten this time. Walking to her car, she typed a reply to Marcus. "Soon, honey. And when you go back, things will be different. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is return to a place that scared us and make it better." The investigation was just beginning, but already it was doing something important. It was showing everyone, especially the children, that justice wasn't just a word. It was something real that happened when good people worked together to make things right. 1 week after the splash pad incident, the Pine Grove Community Center was more crowded than it had ever been. People filled every chair in the large meeting room, and many stood along the walls. Parents, teachers, police officers, and community leaders had all come together for an important town hall meeting. At the front of the room, a panel of speakers sat at a long table. Captain Rivera from the police department was there, along with Mayor Johnson, Mrs. Rodriguez, and Lieutenant Commander Sarah Thompson. They weren't just there to talk about what went wrong. They were there to make things better. "Our community is like a family," Mayor Johnson said, standing at the microphone. "And when one member of our family is hurt, we all feel it. But we also all have the power to heal and improve." In the audience, Marcus and Tiana sat with their friends. They weren't scared anymore. Instead, they felt proud to be part of something important. Their mother had taught them that sometimes bad things happen so good people can come together and fix them. Mrs. Rodriguez stood up next to speak. "I've watched our children grow up from behind my store counter," she said, her voice full of emotion. "They don't see differences when they play together. They just see friends. We adults need to learn from them." The crowd nodded in agreement. Many people remembered buying popsicles and sodas from Mrs. Rodriguez's store, how she'd always kept an eye out for everyone's children. Captain Rivera took the microphone next. "We're making changes in our police department," she announced. "Every officer will receive better training on community relations. We're also starting a new program called Play with Police, where officers will spend time playing games with local children." Sarah Thompson listened carefully to each speaker. She was impressed by how many people wanted to help make things better. When it was her turn to speak, she stood tall in her Navy uniform. "My children were hurt that day at the splash pad," she began. "But something beautiful has grown from that hurt. Look around this room. See how many people care. See how many want to make a difference." She gestured to where Marcus and Tiana sat. "My children learned something important that day. They learned that standing up to wrong things isn't just about being brave. It's about working together, following proper channels, and never giving up until things change." From the back of the room, a young police officer raised his hand. "How can we build trust with the community again?" he asked. Sarah smiled. "The same way we build any relationship, one step at a time, with honesty and respect. It starts with simple things, like learning children's names, waving hello, showing them that the uniform means friend, not enemy." More hands went up, more questions were asked, and more ideas were shared. Someone suggested having monthly community picnics where police officers and families could eat together. Another person proposed starting a youth advisory council where teenagers could share their concerns directly with police leaders. Near the end of the meeting, Tiana raised her hand. The room fell quiet as she walked to the microphone, her brother Marcus right beside her for support. "I was scared that day," she said simply. "But my mom always says that brave people aren't people who never get scared. They're people who do the right thing even when they are scared." Her words touched everyone's hearts. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was about building a better community for all children. As the meeting ended, people didn't rush to leave. They stayed to talk, to share ideas, to make plans. Officer Thompson watched as police officers chatted with parents, as children played together near the water fountain, as her own kids joined in a game of tag with their friends. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared beside her, smiling. "Look at all this," she said, gesturing to the mixed crowd. "Sometimes it takes a storm to help flowers grow." Sarah nodded. The splash pad incident had been painful, but it had woken up the community. People weren't just talking about change anymore. They were making it happen, one conversation, one program, one friendship at a time. As the evening sun shone through the community center windows, it lit up a room full of hope. Tomorrow would be better than yesterday, and the day after would be better still. That's what happens when good people work together to make things right. 1 month had passed since the incident at the splash pad. The summer sun still shone brightly over Pine Grove, but many things had changed in the neighborhood. The biggest change was about to happen today. Officer Barrett stood nervously by the splash pad, wearing his uniform, but without his usual stern face. He had just finished 2 weeks of intensive training on community relations and racial bias. Now it was time to put what he learned into practice. Today was the first Community Splash Day, an event he had helped organize as part of his new duties. Colorful balloons decorated the area, and Mrs. Rodriguez had set up a free ice cream stand near her store. "Remember what we discussed?" Captain Rivera said quietly, standing beside him. She had been supervising his progress closely over the past month. Sarah Thompson arrived with Marcus and Tiana. The children hesitated for a moment when they saw Officer Barrett, but their mother's gentle hand on their shoulders gave them courage. "Good morning, Officer Barrett," Sarah said professionally. She was wearing casual clothes today instead of her Navy uniform, but she still carried herself with the same quiet strength. Barrett took a deep breath. "Lieutenant Commander Thompson," he said, then looked at the children. "Marcus, Tiana, I want to apologize to you properly. What I did was wrong. I let my prejudices control my actions, and I hurt you both. I'm truly sorry." Marcus and Tiana looked at each other, then at their mother. Sarah had taught them about the importance of forgiveness when people truly wanted to change. "We accept your apology," Marcus said. "Mom says everybody can learn and become better." Tiana added, "Just promise you'll be nice to all kids now, not just us." Barrett nodded, his eyes showing real emotion for the first time. "I promise. That's why we're having this event today. I want to help make things right." More families started arriving at the splash pad. Children of all backgrounds came running, excited about the free ice cream and the chance to play in the water. Parents gathered in small groups, talking and laughing together. Mrs. Rodriguez watched from her store entrance, smiling at how different things were from that difficult day a month ago. The internal affairs investigation had led to real changes in the police department. New training programs were in place, and officers now regularly visited schools and community centers to build better relationships. "Ice cream time," she called out, and children came running to her stand. Officer Barrett helped her hand out the treats, learning each child's name and sharing friendly words with their parents. Sarah watched as Marcus and Tiana joined their friends in the water. The splash pad was full of happy sounds again, children laughing, water splashing, parents chatting. This was how it should be. "Your children taught me an important lesson," Officer Barrett said to her quietly. "They showed me that strength isn't about power over others. It's about helping make things better for everyone." Sarah nodded. "That's what I teach my SEAL trainees too. True strength is using your power to protect and serve, not to frighten or control." The afternoon passed peacefully. Officer Barrett played water games with the children, helped younger ones reach the higher water jets, and talked with parents about their concerns. He was different now, not just following orders, but truly understanding why change was necessary. As the sun began to set, families started heading home. Marcus and Tiana were tired but happy. They had seen something important happen. They had watched someone learn from their mistakes and work hard to change. "Mom," Tiana said as they walked home, "remember when you said sometimes bad things happen so good people can make them better?" "Yes, honey," Sarah replied, holding her daughter's hand. "Well, I think we made things better," Tiana said proudly. "Not just for us, but for everybody." Sarah smiled at her children. They had learned valuable lessons about standing up for what's right, about forgiveness, and about how communities can grow stronger through difficult times. Back at the splash pad, Officer Barrett was helping clean up. He looked at the water jets, still spraying their peaceful patterns in the evening light. The same water that had once been used to hurt was now bringing people together, washing away old prejudices and helping grow new understanding. The story of the splash pad incident would be remembered in Pine Grove, not just as a day when something wrong happened, but as the beginning of something right. A community coming together to make sure all children could play, laugh, and grow up feeling safe and respected.